this introduction. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, the only thing is that we can see the next slide.
Ah, hold up then. Okay. Is that better? Oh my.
I think, Francis, if you're projecting on your second screen, that it's best that you share your second screen, or you stop projecting if you have a second screen. I'm assuming that's what is happening.
Does that work? Now?
That's good.
Excellent. Well, hello everyone. Thank you, GP, for the introduction. So we're going to talk about the recycling of aluminum alloy using, using many things, but in the end, we want to use electrochemistry. So as all of you might know, aluminum alloys are used throughout the world in many applications. As you can see, this is aluminum cables for high current applications, and this is one of the aluminum is the third most abundant element on Earth. Some of the pros of using aluminum is that it's lightweight, it's resistant to corrosion because of the oxide layers that passivate it, and it has excellent thermal conductivity. But on the other side, the current process for primary production, which is Lebreux, is energy intensive, and it has lower mechanical properties than steel in most scenarios, let's say. So what are the sources of aluminum scraps or aluminum products that we find in the world? Well, we have primary aluminum, as stated before, produced by Lebreux process. We have secondary aluminum that comes from recycled aluminum, which is scraps, and we will see later the strategies to obtain this. We have a primary scrap, which is the scraps that you use from aluminum manufacturing plants, from inline processes like shavings and cutouts from sheet metals and all that stuff. We have secondary scraps, which is the scrap that you get from demolition works, like old window frames from construction, scrap yards for parts, for car parts and everything. And we have the used beverage cans and so forth and so on. Used beverage can, as represented right there, well, when they're going to be finished and crushed, are an important stream of aluminum scraps. In 2016, Europe accounted for 400,000 tons of recycled material was due to processing UBCs. So it's a very important stream. So aluminum recycling. When we recycle aluminum, two main challenges are present. It's the energy consumption. It needs to be lower than making primary aluminum, because obviously if it's higher, then we're just going to produce more primary aluminum. And it needs to tackle the fact that we accumulate a lot of impurities. I say impurities, but you could count it as alloying elements in most of the cases, but you don't necessarily want 15% silicon in your aluminum. So you need to control the amount of these elements in your final product. And depending on the strategy that you use, you can save up to 95% of the energy used to make primary aluminum. So there's a gain to be made from recycling in terms of energy. So we're going to see four strategies to recycle aluminum alloys from scraps and others. The first strategy is going to be to remelt the scraps. And as the pros of this strategy is that it's low energy investment. All you have to pay in terms of energy is the melting process. And it works wonder with primary scrap from inline manufacturing plants, because you're basically remaking the same alloy that you already needed. The cons is that if you use secondary scraps, they need to be well sorted, or else you're going to have a mixed bag of scraps with not necessarily interesting composition and interesting properties in the end. So you can take scraps and you melt it. That's the process. That's the strategy. You can dilute it with primary aluminum. It has a low energy investment in terms of adding the scraps to the strategy. But if you consider the energy that requires to make the primary aluminum, well, it can be energy intensive. But still, you have a gain of energy from the fact that you reuse some. You differ the energy cost of some of the primaries to secondary by the melting process. And the cons is that you cannot use 50% scraps. You need to dilute it up to a certain point where the alloying elements or the impurities are low enough. So this is a good strategy, but it's limited in terms of scope that can be used. And the third strategy would be to electro-refine the impurities or the alloying elements, such as, and it works for manganese, it would work for sodium, lithium, calcium that you could have from other processes earlier in the line. And what we'll see later, that can produce high purity mag on the side, which is cool. The energy consumption can be much higher than the chlorination process used to eliminate those impurities, and it won't work for all impurities. So for the next recycling strategy is the electro-refining of aluminum, and the process is very similar to Aleru in a sense that it's electrochemical, and you can produce high purity aluminum, and you can remove partially or completely some of the alloying elements from the fact that they're not gonna go from the anode to the molten salt and all the way to the cathode. So you're gonna segregate them into the anode, and you're gonna get the pure aluminum at the cathode, which is very, very nice and very interesting for some applications. The disadvantage is that it has a high energy consumption, such as Aleru. So simulating, how can I? No. Do you know how I can take away the ribbon, or does it matter?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. All right. So it was supposed to be high. There we go. Simulating electrolysis cell in Factsage. So to simulate a cell, many things are necessary, but most importantly, what we want to get is the terms. It's the potential to see, is it possible or not to do this reaction. And you see that the energy that you consume, well, electrical energy is a function of the potential that you apply to the cell, and you have many contributions, such as the thermal contribution that is obtained for the cathodic and the anodic part of the cell. You have the resistivity, which is the resistivity of the electrolyte, the leads, and so forth. And you have the overpotential that is mostly contributed by kinetic barriers and other factors. So when we want to simulate this electrolysis cell in Factsage, it is important that we do it in two separate calculations. One for the anodic component of the cell, and one for the cathodic component of the cell. This way we can have we can simulate this cell. We associate the charge transfer to the transfer of chloride anions in the cell, and we can arrange that it is let's say neutral in terms of charge balance, so that we really simulate a charge transfer and not a chlorination process. So the anodic calculate the transfer from the metal anode, which is this, to the electrolyte layer. So it's an oxidation process with the chloride that's gonna oxidate the metal species. And now that when we first do the steps, we have an electrolyte that we have enriched with the metal that comes from the anode. So we can use this new electrolyte composition to to then go to the cathodic calculation. For the cathodic calculation, what we're going to do is we're going to take the electrolyte and we're going to calculate the transfer from the electrolyte layer to the metal cathode by reduction. And after the cathodic calculation, well, the resulting electrolyte, which is now poor in the metallic elements that we want to reduce, is going to be taken to the anodic calculation interface. And then we're going to do this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you can imagine that it gets pretty tedious that you need to have to go back and forth into equilibrium calculation like this. So if only there was an easier way to do this, it would be very nice, wouldn't it? And this is what I came up with. I came up with some project where you can do the modeling of the process programmatically through the use of KMap, and you have this famous anodic component that we talked about and the cathodic component that we talked about. You can see there's a lot of extras because to fit the process that we wanted to simulate, we thought it was good to add some other things such as an electrolyte, a bulk electrolyte, and some other things, the precipitation steps and some loops, which is cool. And all of this was done using the KMap library developed by GTT. It's a library that contains most of the options of the equilibrium module. It's easier to simulate the process that require feedback loops, such as back and forth processes and feedback loops from recycling feeds. And when it's implemented, it's possible to optimize the operation conditions such as the temperature, the feed rate, and some of these operation factors by exploiting the model and fine-tuning the process. And in conclusion, for those that are not convinced yet, aluminum alloys are radical. They're pretty cool. And there's many recycling strategy that can be used based on the amount and the nature of the scrap that you have in terms of composition and tonnage. And the electrochemical process, when well implemented, can help upgrade the scrap, such as making ultra-pure aluminum and others. And simulating electrolytic cell with Factsage, as we've seen, it can be pretty tedious. We'll see in more detail this afternoon some example we'll do without the KMap thing and just do it through Factsage, and you'll see that it can be tedious. And KMap is a wonderful tool to simulate electrochemical process and complex unit operations such as electrochemical cell. Thank you very much, everyone, and this was my presentation.
Okay, so thank you so much, Francis, for this nice presentation. Maybe before we take any question, I have a few comments here. So one thing that is really important in the future is that the quality of the simulation we'll be able to do will be as good as the quality of the database that we have developed in Factsage. So of course, we want to simulate at the end of the day processes, we want to design them, optimize them, but it is important to remember that the quality of the database will be the key ingredient here to be able to have a good representativity or being closer to reality. The nice thing about Francis' work is that he also used KMap in order to build interface, and I would say we're going in that direction as well, not necessarily in process simulation in Factsage already, but we're trying to integrate more and more flexibility into the ways we're going to use the equilibrium module, etc., to reach such a complex simulation in the future. We're also actively are trying to collaborate with people that design process simulators in order to provide this wonderful tool in the future. So the other point that is important to mention is that on this flow sheet, you will have, I would say, punctual equilibrium calculation. This is what Francis will present this afternoon. And these calculations are performed using the databases that are developed over the past 40 years by the CRCT. So I'll take Francis will take the question. So Eve, are there any specific question on his talk?
It's more of as a general question. Someone is asking for process modeling, which method is preferable, macros or KMap?
Okay, so I would say that depending on the complexity of the simulation, macro processing can be fine, but really for those of you who have some experience or for people that are familiar with programming, you can really deploy the powerfulness or the power of computational thermochemistry when you're using KMap. So this is either or. It is possible to use macro processing, but when you are really into intensive process simulation and calculation, I would say that the KMap is something that you need to consider. And by the way, GTT is our, I would say, cousin. So we're closely tied together, collaborating together in the development of different products. So I'm happy to mention that this is also a wonderful tool that you need to look into. Coupled with our databases from Factsage, it's a really powerful combo, I would say.
There's another question. Someone's asking, do I understand this correctly? There will be a KMap-like feature in Factsage in the future.
Okay, so what I've mentioned, if Francis, you can go back to PowerPoint 17. Or yeah, whatever. This one, yeah. If you can remove the grade, yeah. So what we have in mind, and this will be the work of Rodrigo. So the research associate you saw this morning that talk about the crystal module. So we have two ongoing project. The first one is on the representation of the crystal structure of compound and solution. And the second project would be on the creation of an interface that would allow more flexibility in equilibrium, or let's say another module that we want. This one is not, we didn't start to work on this, but Rodrigo will cover two projects. The second one will be able to drag and drop equilibrium unit on a flow sheet and be able to perform calculation in loops, things like that. We're not saying that we're going to reach process simulation, but at least we're going to add a lot of flexibility in the future with such equivalent process flow sheet.
I don't see any more questions for now.
There's another question. How do you access whether the system of interest to mean the specific range of composition is properly modeled in a database? This is a pretty good question. I'm going to answer it privately, but I want to comment on that. So this is a question from Razi Mohamed. This is one, I would say, important part, and a lot of feedback that we receive from my, I'm putting my, I would say, developer of Factsage, are the quality of the model that we have and to which extent we can use them in different chemical composition range and temperature. I would say that in the future, what we are aiming for is to gather all the experimental information or data that we're using to tune these databases and be able to provide such a feedback in terms of quality of the fit and maybe identify the quality of the prediction of our tool, or at least the error that we have for the data that are available. This is something that might be covered in the future. We are talking about it for different reasons right now at the CRCT, but definitely that's something that we need to, let's say, a better feature in Factsage, because sometimes you want to do a calculation and you're not too sure if in this range of composition, the calculation are good or not. And this, again, goes back to the quality of the database that we have. So if we add a lot of excess parameter and we don't care too much about the models that we're using, then we might end up with weird prediction or interpolation or extrapolation as function of temperature or composition. So this, I would say, is one of the success of the CRCTs, to have people that really try to analyze the data on hand and try to come up with the best set of parameters for our models. So this should answer the two questions that I have now. I'm going to answer them by writing in the Q&A.
I have another question.
Yep.
Somebody asked me, can the atomic models being considered predict polymorphic transitions and intermediate compounds, or is experiment still required?
Okay, of course, I will say that experiments are always required, but if you follow, and this discussion we can continue after, if you follow what we are trying to do, we'll have a module that allows us to generate structure, we'll have the experimental data or the DFT data. And the idea for us is to train potential. There are interatomic potential that are available. And now we can really use this analysis, this neighbor analysis coupled with other approximation to try to predict if a compound would be stable or not. So this is what we're aiming for. I'm not saying that this is what we have at the moment. This is a project, an ongoing project. And the differences between this and running DFT simulation is we hope to be able to explore more rapidly the phase space and the chemical composition space. So it's a slightly different strategy where the focus is a little bit different. So we're not saying that will be as accurate as DFT calculation. We'll try to mimic the result of DFT calculation to tune and train our potential. But then we can really rapidly perform calculation using Factsage with this new module to be able to explore new intermetallic or new, I would say, higher order compound. This is the ideas behind this project. But for now, we're still at, I would say, the early stage, but this is what we're aiming for. Other question? So if not, we can, there's a break. So I'm pleased to answer the question, and we'll come back after the break with the next session on atomistic simulation. So I think it's a nice introduction to that. So please have if you can put me presentator, I'm going to put this time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Also, everyone, if you want to ask questions,